A lot of jobs in Final Fantasy XIV are upfront enough about how their toolkit works that it seems like it really might require you to try to misunderstand them to go completely wrong. But then, there are also some that have at least some very easy to misunderstand interactions, and sometimes these misunderstandings can even originate from a counterintuitive playstyle that used to work. In this video, I want to talk a bit about some of the more weirdly common of these, about why they're bad, if they're always bad, and try to explain how players might arrive at the decision to use these rotations or approaches. I hope you find them interesting. For number 1, we have what at least I have dubbed the Balance Mage. You might already know about the Ice Mage Black Mage, but this one takes it a step further, and in the same fell swoop, a big step further back. The Balance Mage is a rotation you can technically perform by level 35, and simply alternates between Fire 3 and Blizzard 3. There's a possibility that Thunder 3 will be used too, but F3B3 is the name of the game. In fairness, it isn't the worst thing you could do. Pure Scathe spam or using your area of effect options on a single target would both do significantly worse, but that is probably not exactly impressive now, is it? It is also just barely better than simply spamming Blizzard 1, and given the shorter cast time, it is also more mobile than doing so. But that is also where the good news ends. The Balance Mage rotation does 182 potency per GCD due to the 30% reduced damage from using Fire Magic in Umbral Ice 3 and 30% reduced damage from using Ice Magic in Astral Fire 3. Sure, you can do this forever, and it is somewhat mobile, and it feels fast. However, while casting the opposite element like this cuts the cast time in half, it does not cut the recast time, referred to as the global cooldown, in half. Meaning that with no spell speed, you still only get one cast every 2.5 seconds and not every 1.75 seconds. And even if it was every 1.75 seconds, this 182 potency every 1.75 seconds would be equivalent to 104 potency per second. Which means simply spamming Fire 1 in Astral Fire 3 would be nearly 25% stronger than that imaginary potency, and that's also ignoring things like Firestarter procs. It is worth pointing out that this rotation was never good, but the root of this problem is potentially partly that the Black Mage job itself isn't super intuitive, given some information isn't spelled out clearly enough. So how would a new Black Mage player arrive at the conclusion that this rotation is a good idea? Well, one good start is that usually the spell with the higher number on it is supposed to be better, right? In pretty much any other Final Fantasy game, why would you cast Fire if you have access to Firaga and the MP or spell slots to afford it? The same applies to Blizzard and Blizzaga. If you don't pay attention to the damage numbers produced from the attacks, it can also become very easy to focus on the fact that when you alternate between the two spells, they cast faster, so you might be able to convince yourself that this is the right way to play. And even if you read your tooltips, this doesn't give you any indication that what you're doing is incorrect, as the Umbral Ice and Astral Fire descriptions in action tooltips don't really tell you what they do beyond the fact that they appear to be mutually exclusive. And they make the opposite element free and potentially faster to cast. The information that they also make the opposite element weaker and that Astral Fire boosts the damage you do is hidden away in the initial tutorial you got at level 2, or that you could seek out with the active help feature. However, to know that by weaker they mean a whopping 30%, and by Astral Fire boosting fire damage they mean 80%, you have to look it up outside of the game, as the game never outright names this percentage. But if it did, it would be a lot clearer. This is also a misunderstanding that can cause the origin of the Ice Mage. Although both Balance Mage and Ice Mage are also kinds of rotations that can appear as a result of a player simply choosing to not learn more about the job. Even so, if such a player were to pick up the job, simply doing B3 and then B1 until full MP, then F3 and then F1 until 0 MP, and then looping like that, would already be way better than these two outlier rotations. For number 2, we have what I call the ultra slow mage. And no, I'm not talking about a black mage spamming B3 and F3 this time. I'm talking about red mages that neglect to use their fast spells. This usually resolves itself for most red mages as they get acquainted with their toolkit over the first few levels. However, this isn't always the case for all red mages, so let's approach this one anyway. The rotation is, simply put, to only use the Thunder and the Arrow. After all, they do the most damage and generate the most mana, right? The problem here is that these spells take 5 whole seconds to cast and don't double the damage, even compared to measly weak level 50 Jolt with its astounding 180 potency. Sure, only using the Thunder and the Arrow is better than only using Jolt, but it of course doesn't hold a candle to doing the proper rotation of alternating between fast spells and slow spells. If we assume there are no procs to be had, the worst case, in 15 seconds, a proper filler rotation for Red Mage at level 50 can deliver 1440 potency of damage, and generate a combined 30 mana in 3 pairs of spells. The Ultra Slow Mage instead only delivers 2 volleys for combined 1200 potency and 24 mana. A related cousin to this rotation I call the Wrong Proc, which makes a similar mistake but in the opposite direction, using the Stone and the Fire in place of the Air and the Thunder instead of in place of Jolt. Naturally, both of these styles, Ultra Slow and Wrong Proc, have never been good because they're both examples of simply using your toolkit completely wrong. There is, however, one exception to this, and that is, when pulling, the fact that you slow cast a spell is irrelevant, assuming you finish the spell in time before the fight begins. This is what is sometimes referred to as precasting. Now, obviously, the way these players arrive at these rotations is often a misunderstanding. I imagine it is often a case of being overwhelmed with information with a job starting at level 50. Red Mage is unlike most other jobs that start at higher levels because a lot of its tools are designed specifically to make sense at level 50, and starts to make less sense if you try to piece the rotation together in a lower level dungeon, for example. So it stands to reason that it is at least unlikely a Red Mage is outright choosing to play in these ways by choice. With that, in case we have any new Red Mages watching this going, okay, but wait a minute, I do this. Here's how to use your filler rotation correctly. Fast spell, then slow spell. Fast spells include Jolt, the Fire and the Stone, the Arrow 2 and the Thunder 2 for area of effect. Slow spells include the Arrow 1 and 3, the Thunder 1 and 3, and for area of effect, Scatter or Impact. Simply put, if you can use the Stone or the Fire, you use that instead of Jolt. That's it. I also have an actual Red Mage starter guide if you want even more information. Link in the description. For number 3, we have Paladin with... No, fight or flight is physical only. False. For over a decade, Paladin has had access to the ability Fight or Flight, and for over a decade, this ability increased physical damage done by 25%. For less time than that, Paladin has had the ability Requiescat, which does magical damage up front and has enabled the Paladin's Magic Burst, which notably does not do physical damage, obviously. Meaning that for years, Paladins have been incentivized to separate these two actions quite clearly. With Paladin's rework, however, Fight or Flight has been changed to increase all damage done by 25%. And since your strongest attacks are locked behind Requiescat, it makes sense to combine these two attacks in such a way that Fight or Flight also boosts the damage that comes from using Requiescat itself. With that said, a rotation intentionally separating these two abilities on a modern Paladin would presumably entail the Paladin using Goring Blade, 3 Atonements, Royal Authority, and 3 more Atonements during Fight or Flight, and then using the Magic Burst after that. Given that you will get those magic spells anyway, and you will get to use those atonements anyway. The important part of the problem with this rotation is more with the placement of Fight or Flight than with Requiescat. The gold standard burst sequence for Fight or Flight, which includes Scoring Blade, the Magic Burst, 1 or 2 Holy Spirits, and 1 or 2 Atonements or Royal Authority, results in over 450 potency gained over this perfectly optimized physical sequence I suggested before. This particular rotation style of course originates from a misunderstanding. Either the player might never have considered that Fight or Flight, above that, mind you, has an icon of swords, might also boost the damage of magic, or maybe the player came back to the game and given most of the toolkit still looks mostly the same-ish, didn't consider that there were such significant changes to the job in the first place. It should be somewhat obvious that separating Fight or Flight and Requiescat used to be not just good, but optimal, because before Paladin's rework, they genuinely had no synergy. Which is of course the reason why the primary way players would arrive at doing this now is not realizing things have changed. Speaking of Atonement, Atonement Dropping is another type of rotation quirk that has been a thing since Shadowbringers, but has been somewhat phased out due to job adjustments. The idea of Atonement Dropping is that you could make sure you could properly align your combo sequence with exactly when Fight or Flight came off cooldown, so you started your physical sequence exactly on the minute instead of 1 GCD late. It turned out that you only had to sacrifice precisely 1 Atonement use to make this happen. With the rework of Paladin, Atonement Dropping sort of stayed around because it allowed you to get the best burst sequence by making sure you entered every burst using Holy Spirit, Royal Authority, Holy Spirit at the end. However, when the job was initially reworked, Atonement Dropping was already considered a big enough loss that the gain during the burst had to be pretty significant to justify this quirk. Over time, attacks such as Atonement got more buffs, and now Atonement doesn't even break your combo as a Paladin. And all this has caused Atonement Dropping to become an objectively worse choice than simply making the most of your rotation at any given moment, making use of the somewhat well-known priority rotation Paladins use now. Unlike the physical Fight or Flight misunderstanding thing, Atonement Dropping might, in very niche circumstances, potentially be worth doing. Maybe. The question to ask is whether a 50 potency gain during raid buffs is worth a potential 200 potency loss later. And sometimes, like for example when the boss is close to death, this is actually beneficial because that 200 potency loss simply never comes. Now, for number 4, we have Dancer Devilment first. This is specifically about openers and bursts for dancers. Most dancers will, and should, open a fight with standard finish to get that damage buff rolling. The damage is good too. After that, the next step is usually technical finish. However, technical finish is also the dancer's single most powerful attack, so logically you might want to boost that with a buff like Devilment, right? But to do that, you have to use Devilment before technical step. And from using technical step to technical finish, it takes around 3 GZDs of time in total. Meaning that technical finish is more fairly observed as a 400 potency per GZD action than a wowie zowie 1200 potency action. And at 400 potency, it certainly might not be the most important thing to use Devilment on. With that said, that also gives rise to another opener mistake from dancers, which is technical first, which also has a good reasoning behind it. You could set up standard finish so you have the buff already. As long as standard finish is ready when the fight actually begins, this is fine. Then do technical step, do the 4 steps, and then use technical finish right on pull. That way, technical finish is closer to less than 1 GZD, and then those 1200 potency are way better, right? Well, yes and no. In a casual context, it probably doesn't really matter that much, but if anyone in your group is trying to optimize, they're probably using their burst around 7 or 8 seconds into the fight. Incidentally, when Technical Finish would have been cast naturally if you had started the fight with Standard Finish into Technical Step instead. Another thing is that if you have prepared Technical Step before the fight begins, it is possible you're using Technical Finish a few seconds later than what would normally happen in an active battle, which causes the cooldown of Technical Finish to be awkwardly slightly off compared to Devilment. What makes this somewhat weird is that because Dancer's personal damage is on the lower end of the DPS spectrum because a part of its value isn't boosting the damage of someone else, making sure that your damage buffs align nicely for the DPS you're partnering with is more likely to maximize the value you both get out of it. If you use Devilment right after Technical Finish, then you get 20 seconds of both 5% more raid damage and 20% more crit and direct hit chance for you and your partner. And these kinds of things stack with each other for a greater whole. In other words, the value of making sure Technical Finish and Devilment are active at the same time outweighs the potential gain should Devilment result in Technical Finish being a critical direct hit. However, as you can probably hear, both leading with Technical Finish right at the top of a fight and leading with Devilment before Technical Step itself are both things that you could logically reason yourself to. And the reasons why these strategies are considered wrong or bad are more because of other, better observations separate from them. I should also mention that there could be niche cases where a fight requires the burst to start so early that setting up Standard Finish outside of combat and then leading with Technical Finish into Devilment might be better. So there can be specific cases where the Technical First isn't bad. Which leads us to the final number 5 of this list. Ninja's Single Target Doton. Essentially, this rotation entails maintaining Doton at all times throughout a single target fight. Notably, maintaining Doton on 2 or more targets when below max level is actually good. 3 or more at max level due to the value Raiju provides. Now, the ninja rotation itself is very heavily burst-centric, and mudras are usually, in some capacity, stockpiled for these bursts. Doton being a damage over time effect would instead consume most or all of those mudras to simply maintain, burst or no, which is probably already a bad sign. Now, why is that a bad thing? Well, Raiton does 650 potency of damage, ignoring the Raiju part, and Doton does 80 potency up front when placed and then does an additional 80 potency every time it ticks, once every 3 seconds. Which adds up to a combined 7 times 80, including the initial hit, which equates to 560 potency. As such, simply placing Doton instead of using Raiton is a 90 potency loss on a single target. Now, was it always worse? No. Before Endwalker, Raiton's potency was 800, and Doton did 100 potency up front, and then ticked 8 times over 24 seconds instead, leading to a combined 9 times 100, 900 potency. Meaning that, hypothetically, if that single enemy stayed in Doton for the full duration, Doton could beat Raiton. Endwalker changed this, alongside many other oddities like it, where an area of effect attack might be better on single target than the intended single target option. These AoE options were changed to clearly be worse than the single target option in such situations. Now, how did players arrive at the conclusion to do Single Target Doton? Well, to start, because of this fact that it used to be good, there might be a lot of guides that are now outdated that still say this. So someone might end up getting wrong advice as a result. Make sure you're watching an Endwalker guide at the very least if you want to be sure. Another way players can arrive at this conclusion is that before patch 6.1 in Endwalker, ninjas could sometimes gain a small amount of free damage by placing Doton before fight began, if the tank simply moved the boss into the Doton area in time. With patch 6.1, Hide now deletes Doton, so this strategy is no longer worthwhile. But this can still give the impression that using Doton on single target can be a good thing when it isn't. A third way players land on this conclusion is indeed watching other players do it, as this single target Doton tactic is prevalent enough at level 50 in things like Crystal Tower that newer players might assume the other ninjas know what they're doing and simply copy them. In addition to this, a fourth option is that Doton uses 3 signs, whereas Raiton uses only 2, so some players assume 3 signs is always better. And finally, the fifth way that I at least have met is simply not knowing how dot ticks work. Doton says it deals 80 potency to any who enter, implying that Doton deals damage every time someone enters. So if you pull an enemy out and into the circle repeatedly, they would take more damage, right? But that is not even how Doton works. And if Doton's dot ticked every 2 or even every second, it would be far better than, genuinely, anything else in the ninja toolkit. So, have you met some weird rotation quirks in your time playing? Maybe some so weird that it was difficult to explain why the right option is right and that oddity they're going with is wrong? Either way, I would love to hear about them in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, as Doton takes 1 extra sign to perform than Raiton, Doton actually takes around half a second longer to cast. So even if they did the exact same amount of damage, Doton would still actually be worse on a single target.